The world is perhaps more polarized than ever. Frequent confusion between fact and opinion can present challenges while trying to keep employees focused on work and not distracted or forming factions. It's common for defenses to be high when difficult conversations roll around, so it's key that you have a plan for when they do. Welcome back to Yo's podcast, Back to Work. I'm your host, Joe McIntyre, and on this podcast, we are discussing tips to make difficult conversations easier to deal with for a positive and productive workplace environment. Today, I'm excited to welcome LaTanya Wood, Program Director for a nonprofit in Glassboro, New Jersey. LaTanya, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So happy to have you. So let's maybe start out with, everybody knows at this point, political talk is pretty high. So what should HR and people within organizations do to ensure a workplace that is safe and welcoming for all folks?
Well, one of the things we want to make sure is that HR would have policies in place that kind of guide and give some structure to staff that are working for any company to be able to have safe conversations.
Now, specifically, how do you ensure employees are not sharing political opinions that may or may not be hurtful or disseminating incorrect information throughout the office?
Well, sometimes that can be a little bit difficult, but as I said in the first question, you want to make sure that you have some policies in place that give some guidance to employees on what is permissible in the workplace and what is not. When you do find that there were perhaps hurtful things that are taking place in the organization, those things have to be addressed by the supervisors and HR.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that these kinds of conversations, political or otherwise, are happening more? Is it just because of just the general polarizing nature of politics now, or is it because of social media, or has the world changed? Obviously, with everybody going remote, that there's more online conversation. Why do you think this? This is such an important conversation to have for us.
I think it's a combination of all three, to be honest with you. It just seems that people feel freer to express, their opinions, and sometimes without recourse.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think we probably know this, but it is important to recognize the impact that news can have on our team, whether good or bad. Different events will have different impacts on everybody. So, when important events happen across the world, political in nature potentially, is there a best practice when it comes to handling those conversations that may come up? Should managers kind of talk about it? Should they just kind of reinforce those policies that HR has in place? What should they do?
I really think it's important for managers to be open about it. So much that is taking place in the world right now really does impact everyone, not just in their home, but also most importantly in the workplace where they are for most of the day. So I think it's important for managers to be open and also not be afraid to address conversations. Some of it relates to work, some of it does not, and to be open enough to guide the employee and the conversation.
Let's say you're an employee at your work and someone says something that bothers you in some shape or form. What should they do about that? Should they go directly to their manager? Should they confront the person? What is the best practice there?
I think it's good for the person to share that, the conversation bothers them, and that, it's not welcomed.
Mm-hmm.
If the person continues, then certainly they need to be told, I need to speak to my supervisor and also to HR. But it's good to put the person on notice. At least that way they know that their behavior is not appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Is it I guess is it more likely when that happens that someone maybe would reconsider what they're thinking, or I think this can probably sometimes happen where folks can tend to get defensive. Is there a way to kind of manage that challenge?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly if the person is defensive about it, it's not always best to continue the conversation, but still to give them notice that you are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It could turn out the other way, where there's a positive outcome, where the person realizes that what they're saying is offensive and curtails their behavior.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's say there is kind of a little bit of a strife where some employees may not be getting along with each other. Are there any techniques for folks in HR or managers to deal with two employees who kind of can't seem to get along?
Yes, I would say, one of the first things you want to do is to figure out why. get the two employees together, figure out why they're not getting along. If there is something that can change in that particular relationship, to explore that. It's important to know, like, what do you really want out of this? What is the conflict? Let's just get right to the bottom line. And then to try to work with the employees on some strategies. Are there triggers that are affecting one employee and not the other? Is there a way to maybe have them have less contact, in the workplace? But at the end of the day, it needs to be a safe, professional point made to each employee that it is the workplace. We're here for work. We're not necessarily here to like each other, but we do have to be professional.
Yeah. I think that aspect of liking each other, I think all of us, for the most part, probably want to be liked. And when someone either disagrees with us or for some reason doesn't seem to like us or vice versa, it could be a challenge. Is it part of maybe just being a professional to understand and accept that you're not always going to get along with your coworkers and you kind of need to find, a middle ground that works in a professional relationship? Is there any way to deal with that you've experienced where it comes to, I may not like this person, but I need to find a professional way to work with
I think it's a fine art that's not often taught
them?
to,
Yes.
to employees in the workplace. Just really trying to coach them into what is professional behavior? What is the mission of why you're here working at this company? What is it that you're supposed to do? How is it that you can focus on the work and not those things that perhaps are irritating you? And if there's a way for us to help you, to coach you into being a better worker, or coach you out if you can't carry out the mission.
Now, there's been a lot of talk, I think, about safe spaces, whether that in terms of conversation or just a place to go and feel, comfortable being yourself. And when it comes to the workplace, is there a place to have, so-called safe spaces for discussion about certain topics? Is there a way to, have people in one room talking about some of those difficult conversations, especially when it comes to the workplace, whether it be DE&I initiatives or otherwise, to have those conversations in a productive and effective way?
I think that there are. I do believe that having open forums for employees to one, communicate and also receive information is really important. And then to have at least someone who can facilitate that in a therapeutic way.
Yeah, do they need to be always structured? Is it better to be more structure, less structure in these types of meetings? What is your experience there?
It doesn't always have to be so structured, just the point that this is an open forum or community meeting that we're having today because of X, Y, and Z has happened in the workplace, or I'll give you an example, even how the pandemic was affecting, some of the staff, whether we would be working remotely, whether we would be in the office, what some of the boundaries were, how to keep that all together and to allow employees to express themselves.
Do you think the pandemic and the move to remote work, with some people, I think, now working back in person, some still working fully remote, some in hybrid, it has worsened or improved, I guess, conversations in the workplace that are maybe more difficult?
I don't think people get a chance to interact as much face to face as, prior to the pandemic. And I think that's a little bit of a drawback. But I think it has taught us in other ways to communicate differently and to try to be more effective. The fact that some of us are working remotely.
Mhm. Now, in your career, have you encountered a time where an employer had to address a challenge or a recent event that seemed to be affecting people in the workplace? What was your experience there? Anything that you can kind of point to and offer any advice for our listeners?
Yes, certainly in my career, I've certainly had to deal with many difficult situations and to deal with employees, on a one-to-one or as groups. I still think it's important to have a soft approach, if you will, because we're all human and we all have different feelings. And it's important to kind of meet people where they are and then to try to work with them to get to where you want them to be. So you can't be afraid. If you can't be afraid if you're a manager to really work with people or an administrator to run an organization and to deal with some of your most difficult challenges.
That's where the best managers shine, I imagine, when those difficult situations arise. It's not when everything's going well, business is booming, everybody's getting along. It's those
Right.
challenging times that the best managers rise.
Yeah, you have to be able to walk into the storm.
That's for sure. Do you have any experience recently where you resolved a dispute between two employees? How did that go? What were some of your strategies that you used when two employees kind of were butting heads a little bit?
Not recently, but I would say in the past 2 years, yes, dealing with employees that were not getting along and really just trying to appeal to them to basically put aside their differences, work together for the good of the team. And then, most importantly, I would say another point is to check in with them often, because sometimes these things just don't resolve by one conversation. It does take some coaching. It does take some mentoring in order to get people to the level that you want them to be on when they have conflict.
Mhm. Now, I think so far we've talked about two employees, probably, or a group of employees who are, for the most part, on the same level, not getting along. Let's say your manager, for some reason, says something that bothers you, or is something that probably shouldn't be brought up in the office when they're above you in the chain of command. Is there a way to approach that that can be, delicate enough and and work for everybody?
You're speaking of someone who would be my superior?
Correct.
Yes. There is a way to deal with it, but it is a touchy issue because, that person certainly is in a position of power. You don't want to offend them, even though you may have been offended, but there's a nice way to say it so that they get the message.
How should they go about doing that? What is that nice way? Is there a go-to strategy, a go-to phrase or policy, I guess, to go above them or figure out how that works?
Just to say, just to be pointed.
Mhm.
Wow, what you're saying is making me a little bit uncomfortable, and I'm not really sure what you mean by that. Could you clarify it for me? And then, if the person is receptive, they will do that. If they're not, if it continues, then there's a way to go around it. Just say, listen, I'm not really comfortable having these conversations with you. Do you mind if we bring in your superior? And that's difficult because if it is a person in a power of position, that can be very dicey.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure many of us have dealt with that, and
Hmm.
it can be a confusing time because you want to make sure you're still being a quote unquote good employee, but also there is an opportunity, like you talked about before, where someone may say, "Oh, I didn't understand, or I didn't realize what I was saying could be hurtful." So um,
And for
that's
the
the best case scenario, probably. But
and for the person that it's happening to, or it's uncomfortable because you want to keep your job and you don't want to have any repercussions. So you want to try to find a way around it, if you can.
mhm. Well, LaTanya, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this podcast and sharing your insights on handling difficult conversations at work. Certainly, everybody, for the most part, I imagine, deals with these every once in a while. So it's good to hear it from an expert who knows some of the strategies to go about handling these. For our listeners who want to get in touch with LaTanya, we will include her email address in our episode description. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning into Yo's Back to Work podcast. To hear future episodes of the podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen in. For Yo's Back to Work, I'm Joe McIntyre. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.